And so this is really going to be an overview or kind of a reminder rather than sort of digging into this as we could probably in its own 2-hour workshop. So one way to visualize power, privilege, and the opposite of the spectrum, marginalization and oppression, is with one of these wheel type figures here, where each of the pie shapes is a social identity or a dimension of social identity. And then the idea is that each individual is kind of a unique combination of the different dimensions of social identity. People who have more of these dimensions, they are more on the ends that are in the center of the wheel, are people that are conferred kind of more power and privilege in our society, whereas people who have more dimensions that are around the outside of the wheel are more likely to be oppressed and marginalized. So as we move through the other material coming up, there's a couple of things we want you to keep in mind in terms of power, privilege, and oppression, marginalization. So the first one of those is that all people can be agents and targets of oppression. So if you think of people as individuals as being a combination of many dimensions of social identity, then on some of those dimensions, you might be nearer to the middle, and so in some situations be in a position of power, but then along other dimensions you might be nearer to the edge, and so in some situations be more marginalized. And so everybody has probably at some point in their life had both of these experiences. However, we don't want to lose sight of the fact that that this wheel has strong implications about how we interact in our society. An important characteristic of this wheel is that the agent group, so the group that tends to cluster kind of in the middle of the wheel, are the ones who are defining what is normal, what is real, what is correct behavior or language or action in our society. And the people around the outside of the wheel are less able to contribute to defining what are considered our social norms. And so then, of course, individuals can kind of police those norms and establish those norms. But what then tends to happen over time is that differential treatment of people in the middle versus the outside of the wheel becomes institutionalized, or what we call systemic. And this can happen through policy or just through normative practices. So one of the other things that we want to talk a little bit more about, and is another mechanism of this kind of systemic power privilege dynamic, is implicit bias. So another mechanism of kind of reifying systemic power is implicit bias. So next, yeah, and next. So again, implicit bias is a concept that probably most of you have been familiarized with at a previous time. But this is just a reminder. So explicit bias is kind of that type of bias or that type of kind of stereotypical behavior that is fairly easy to recognize. When we do it ourselves, we recognize it. When other people do it, we often recognize it. And so implicit bias is much more insidious. So it's hard to recognize in ourselves. It's hard to recognize in other people. And the reason for that sort of invisibility is because these biases are based on our societal norms. And so if to the extent that you are on one of the, or that you're the end of the spectrum of some of these social identity dimensions that you're on puts you in the middle of the power wheel, then the group that you belong to has established these norms, and these norms then become kind of invisible to you. And if you behave or use language in certain ways, then you might not notice it. Now, hopefully, most people here have been to some kind of a workshop before on recognizing bias. Our group holds one, and so bias shouldn't be completely invisible to us. We might be able to recognize it. Now, here's an example that I kind of concocted. So there's 12 people here, and what I want you to do is pick out the 6 engineers from these people and pick out the 6 nurses. So if you just take 1 second and kind of do that, what I'm going to explain is this is a concocted exercise that I made up. And if you advance it, Olivia, then here, in fact, are the nurses in the pictures. So you'll notice that I included 3 men and 3 women. So then, of course, the engineers are also 3 men and 3 women. And so this is concocted because engineering is a field that is overrepresented by men. Nursing is a field that is overrepresented by women. If you went into this exercise with that norm in mind or with that stereotype in mind, you might have picked more of the men as engineers, more of the women as nurses, and then you would have made a mistake. And this is exactly what implicit bias is that we use data from the environment that we have collected throughout our lives to take shortcuts with our behavior and with our language. And when we take those shortcuts, we risk making mistakes. Okay, so implicit bias is everywhere. And what we want to talk about today is first of all, why don't people intervene more? But actually, that's more a conversation about why is it that people do intervene when they notice or recognize a bias incident going on? And why is it that people don't intervene? So we're kind of making the assumption that people are recognizing there's a bias incident. And then what happens after that in terms of the decision process? So here are some interesting data. So in this study here, what they did was they asked, largely our examples today are going to focus on men as allies to women on the gender dimension of the power wheel. And so in this study, they were asking men, how personally committed are you to interrupting when a sexist bias incident occurs? And they found that 86% of men in this particular workforce were personally committed. However, when they asked them, how confident are you about being able to interrupt, only 31% said that they were confident. Okay, so there's a reason, right? If I might want to, but if I don't feel confident doing it, then I might not intervene. These data don't tell us whether these men actually did or not, just you can assume if they don't feel confident, they might not. Okay, so confidence then is part of the right-hand side of this figure. There are a number of characteristics, confidence included in that we would include in a group of characteristics that kind of sum up our personal agency around interrupting a bias event. And those characteristics put together into kind of a personal agency characteristic influence the likelihood of us as individuals interrupting. The important point on this slide is that an equal contributor to whether or not someone will interrupt a bias incident is organizational conditions. And so the first thing to note is that it's not just all personal agency. So if we fail to interrupt, that's not necessarily a failure on the part of ourselves, because there are all kinds of environmental conditions that are also influencing your decision to interrupt or not. And it's good to know about those. So over here, we have organizational conditions contributing almost the same amount to people's decisions. We're going to focus in on one of these characteristics because we don't have time to go into them all, climate of silence. And so, of course, climate of silence is sort of this idea that your workplace makes you feel comfortable speaking up when something happens. So maybe this is obvious, but when they ask men, how likely are you to do nothing about a bias incident? and those men have previously reported that they are in a high silence climate, then they are much more likely to say they will do nothing than men that come from a low silence climate. So this is just pointing out that it's not only us, the person, and our characteristics that influence our decision. It's also the environment of the institution that we are in that can influence that. So I'm going to pass this off to Olivia, and we're going to do another poll.
Thanks, Tom and Matt, for getting us started. So yes, we're going to start with another poll. We wanted to get an idea of the people in this room. What kind of follow-up has happened in those instances of bias that we were thinking about in the past? Have you spoken to the person who was maybe the target of the harm that happened? And sometimes, the bias can be kind of more general. Maybe it's not targeted at someone, but maybe someone in the room that was witness to, participant to the bias that happened. Did you talk to them after the fact? Did you check in on how they were doing? Maybe mention, wow, that stinked, that was terrible. Anyone here that maybe did or did not follow up with the person that experienced the harm in that situation? And I'll give a few seconds for people to go ahead and respond. It might take a minute on our side for the software to catch up. And let me know if you did respond and we're not getting real-time feedback. Sometimes the Poll Everywhere software can be kind of wonky when you try to do a plugin. Gotcha.
Yeah, I responded as well.
What happened there? Normally it checks through. Well, if people are comfortable, I know that it was anonymous. Perhaps someone would be willing to share an experience, even if it's Matt or Tom, of maybe a time that they did or didn't follow up with somebody. You can either put it in the chat, or maybe if one of our presenters wants to speak up on the situation.
I would say that there's been more than once that I've had to follow up with the person. And the examples that pop into my head were times when I was the one that committed the bias. So I tried to make it a point to own any mistakes I made. In terms of times I witnessed it and followed up with somebody, it's going to sound phony, but I'm pretty sure I have, but I can't think of any specific examples. So definitely would take somebody who is a little bit more articulate to share their experience if so moved and if comfortable about this.
Yeah, definitely. And I think it's one of those things that maybe sometimes people don't even think about. And they just go, hey, I'm sorry that happened. How are you feeling? It's very kind of off the cuff, very easy way to respond to a situation that happened. Okay, I'm getting an anonymous one that I got messaged to me, so I will keep it brief. But yeah, wanted to let the person know that the incident happened and was caught. It was seen, viewed as something that wasn't okay. That's a big motivator for a lot of people, to make sure that someone who experienced harm didn't feel isolated or unnoticed. That's a really big one and a great reason to do so. Yeah, thank you for the anonymous person that shared. And we're going to do this same exercise, but we're going to have a conversation about maybe following up with someone who did the harm. Oh, there we go. I just had to click through. Somehow it started.
Ta-da, we meant to do that.
Yeah, exactly. There you go. So this is the same kind of idea, but we're thinking about the person who perpetrated the harm. Okay, we're getting a few no's. Yeah. Thinking about maybe someone who said something that wasn't okay, you followed up with them and let them know, hey, maybe you didn't realize it, this wasn't okay. And having a conversation maybe to get them thinking about maybe what they should change in the future or reflect on what they said. So it looks like a good number of people maybe haven't had the ability to do that, and that's okay. That's not something bad by any means, but it is something to consider that when we want to intervene, when we want to respond to a situation, there are kind of three parties to this: people who witness it and maybe didn't perpetrate it or weren't harmed. There are people who did perpetrate the harm, and then people who were harmed. And we can respond to both of the people, in this kind of relationship, in this incident. And what we can do to have that conversation is something that we're actually going to talk about in a little bit here. So I appreciate everybody sticking with us with some of the technical wonkiness. So what we're going to do in this section is talk a little bit about kind of the cognitive process that happens when we're thinking of an intervention moment of space where we can see an incident and we might be in the process of responding. And then we'll talk about a few of the strategies that can go into a response and maybe some of the benefits and drawbacks that come with each of these strategies and how we might internalize that and bring it into our personal repertoire. So when we talk about the intervention decision process, it's kind of this cognitive tree that happens with people that begins when you notice the incident. And that's like a first step. That's our 101 workshop that we hold. We talk about what does a bias incident look like, what kind of characterizes the mechanism of implicit bias, but also the experience of implicit bias. So it starts off with noticing the event. Then we kind of break off into interpreting a need for an intervention. Sometimes, people will see an event and go, okay, maybe I do or don't need to intervene. It can be a sense of fear that drives people to downplay the need for intervention. Sometimes it's in the process of something happening, someone else intervenes and we feel like, okay, that was resolved. But it is a decision tree that happens where people will either kind of move forward into deciding to intervene, or they will break off. And then in that next set of decision tree, if you will, you've noticed, you've interpreted a need, and you've accepted responsibility or you reject it. Again, this can be sometimes tied to confidence. It can be tied to an awareness of what to do. It can be tied to a sense of safety and kind of evaluating the space that you're in, and maybe other people will be more suited to have that conversation. But what we're really going to focus on is the last two sections. And the first part of the last two decision tree moments is knowing how to intervene. And that's what we're here for, right? Everyone, I think, that has come to attend this particular workshop has at least made it through the first three levels. They've noticed or understood that bias has happened. They've interpreted that there's a need to intervene. And in some ways, they've accepted responsibility, but maybe they don't know how to. They have not talked about intervention options before. They haven't thought about their place in the intervention process. And we appreciate everyone's enthusiasm in being a part of this conversation. And like we said before at the beginning of the session, we really want to promote a feeling of confidence. That's kind of the final stage. You know what to do and you feel confident that you can do it. And even if you don't feel confident that maybe it will be 100% perfect, everybody is resolved, you feel confident that doing something, you can do something that matters. And what is important to remember is that as you're going through this decision tree, as you're going through the process of deciding to intervene, the more that you do that, the more that you think about what it means to intervene and what you can do, the easier it gets, the quicker that reflex, that decision tree moves forward. And so the common kind of style of intervention that a lot of people will hear is the 5 Ds of bystander intervention. And what we've done here is we've kind of modeled the original 5 Ds, which is very focused on kind of more explicit instances where there's really deep harm happening and that it's something that you need to be very responsive to. And we brought it to a more colloquial situational awareness. And we wanted to translate it specifically because we wanted people to feel comfortable that implicit bias happens in our everyday spaces, and we can translate these specific strategies into our everyday spaces as well. And so the first one we're going to talk about is direct, which literally means directly addressing the situation. So you call out maybe someone said something that was particularly problematic, and you tell them in that moment, in that space, and say, I think you should reconsider what you just said. You maybe harmed people who were or weren't in the room, and how might you readjust that language in the future? So that's direct. Then we have distract, and distract is really about disrupting the situation, disrupting the harmful behavior without necessarily drawing attention in a way that could potentially escalate. You're trying to take away attention and maybe some of that harm that's happening to that individual or to that group, and diverting it so that they can maybe get away or have space to feel a little bit more able to process. Then we have delegate, which is really about enlisting the help of someone else to come in and intervene with you. If that person, might be a colleague, might be a peer, might be a supervisor somewhere else in your department, just having that extra help in trying to address what happened in this situation, and do something to make sure that it doesn't happen again, or that it is actually recognized. Then we have the delay option, and this is going to be more of a conversation in a little bit here, and we'll give an example, but delay is the idea of responding after some time has passed. So maybe it's not as easy to intervene in the moment. Maybe it was something was said in a seminar that you can't really engage with, and you decide to follow up after the fact with the person and let them know, hey, this wasn't so great what you said, or following up with the individual who maybe was the target of the harm in that situation, like we talked about earlier with our polls. And then lastly, and this is more of a recent kind of addition to the bystander model, is talking about gathering evidence that something has happened. A lot of people will do this. It's like saving emails, where someone said something harmful, and with the intention that if the person who was harmed wants to report, this is kind of a part of that process of reporting. It is making sure that they have evidence so that their case is considered more thoroughly. So those are the 5 Ds, and we'll kind of have a further conversation about some of the benefits and drawbacks of each of these intervention strategies. And I'm encouraging people, and I'll have my fellow presenters kind of call some of these out. But when we're talking about benefits and drawbacks, we have some that kind of come to mind very clearly, but you all might think of ones that appear as you're listening to us talk about it. So I would definitely encourage folks, if they want, they can drop it in the chat, and I'll have fellow presenters let us know what people are saying.
We do have a comment.
Go ahead.
Yeah, we have a comment that says, when I saw delay, my mind went to committee work and trying to put off a decision that may be biased until evaluation criteria can be more carefully evaluated. Oh, this is just a comment. It's not an actual question. Sorry, I should have read the whole thing. I guess I have a mental association between delay and committee. So thank you for that.
That can definitely happen. Sometimes delay has, and we'll talk a little bit more about this in the benefits and drawbacks section, but delay can have some of that negative connotation of not necessarily addressing it in the most timely manner. But before we get started with the benefits and drawbacks, I am going to ask Tom to kind of walk through a potential combination of these strategies to give people a better idea of just how diverse your intervention approach can be, and the ways that you can utilize these strategies to best address the situation. So I'll let Tom get started for us on the first. Here we go.
Okay, so in trying to think about the 5 Ds, which, as Olivia said, is usually intended for kind of more severe explicit bias incidents. So in trying to adapt that to more implicit bias incidents, we had to do some kind of work on that. And one of the things we found is that it might be kind of individual. And so the first thing I want to emphasize is this is my personal example of how I might take those 5 Ds and kind of think about them in terms of implicit bias instead of the more explicit kind of events that happen. And I think an important aspect of that is that we don't, most of us aren't in a workplace or in a society where it has been normalized yet to call out or call in implicit bias incidents, whereas explicit bias, it's like everybody kind of knows something went on and an intervention should maybe happen there. So this is the way I kind of conceived of it. And like I said, everybody's going to be individual here, but I kind of thought of this as a bit of a timeline. And so it's interesting that we've already kind of had a conversation about delays, but there's kind of, I think the feedback that I have gotten over the years from people talking about intervention and bias incidents, implicit bias incidents is, and that we saw in the poll at the very beginning was that, well, I missed my chance. It happened so fast, I didn't do anything. And so then I can't do anything. And so, but I think what we're talking about there is that there are certain interventions that belong in the moment and in the moment only. And so, for instance, just addressing it directly, right, is okay, wait a minute, somebody said something they shouldn't have said. I'm going to tell them that they shouldn't have said that in the nicest way and courteous way possible, but I'm going to address it directly in the situation. And in a minute, Olivia is going to kind of go through the risk-benefit analysis of doing these, because obviously here there's a risk of escalation, but we're not going to talk about those quite yet. We're going to save that for a minute. Also, in the moment, you could distract. So there's a whole literature on how people might distract the situation by using humor or something like that. And so these are a couple of different ways that you could act in the moment to try and address an implicit bias incident as it was happening. And so for me, though, there's a lot of opportunity to still intervene, even if you delay. So delaying is not always a bad thing, because as Olivia is going to tell you, there are maybe some drawbacks to acting in the moment. So then how can we act after a delay period to maybe help the situation in the sense that we haven't missed our moment, we haven't missed our opportunity. Here are things we could do. So for instance, close to the incident, which, is say in the same meeting or, really close, a few minutes away or that kind of thing. What could I do? Well, can I circle back to the thing that happened now that I've processed it and other people have processed it, and maybe then address it directly, but after a little bit of time has passed, because now maybe it won't escalate the situation as much, or whatever the factors were that you were considering in the moment can now have now gone away after a slight delay has happened. So that's one possibility. And then I think something that our polls maybe were trying to get at about, hey, have you ever after the fact talked to the person who was harmed, talked to the person who was doing the harm, is that, okay, after the meeting's over or the next day or something like that, do you check in with the people who were involved in the incident and talk to them about it and find out how they're feeling or find out what the intention of the person was who was maybe doing the harm. These kind of follow-up things that happen at a delay give us another opportunity to intervene, even if in the moment we feel like we missed our chance, right? And then finally, there's documenting, which is kind of a longer term, either something formal or even something that is just sort of building up data over time. So in terms of this timeline, maybe document might be kind of the longest term kind of thinking about that. So just remind you, this is kind of my example of intervention possibilities developed from the 5Ds. Everybody might have their own specific way that they think about that. Okay, back to you, Olivia.
Thanks for your example and your kind of decision-making process that you explained as you went on. So we'll move into some of that benefit and drawback analysis to give people a better idea of strategies that might work for them or maybe not work for them, or the considerations we might have for the situations. So first is that direct, which again is talking about explicitly addressing the situation. So some of the potential benefits, right, is that you are naming what happened. You are making the person or people around you aware that bias has happened. And that's really powerful because like we talked about earlier, some people maybe aren't aware of that, maybe haven't done the process of unpacking some of those biases and how they show up in the workplace, in the classroom, that sort of thing. And it creates immediate accountability. You are telling that person, telling maybe that group of people that you have done harm or you have the potential for doing harm, and having them think about ways to either apologize or in the future address and adjust what their behavior was. Some of the drawbacks, though, is that it can raise tension. We all know that sometimes people, a lot of times, really don't like to be critiqued. And when they hear, you've done something wrong, there's often a defensiveness that comes out for people. And that can be difficult to process. And in part of that is that you have to have the ability to confront others. Some people, for a variety of reasons, if it's their social position, if it's some of their personality, it can be harder to confront the individual. So that's some of the kind of benefit drawback. And again, I encourage people, if you're thinking about what these benefits and drawbacks can be for each strategy, feel free to share them in the chat. That can help us kind of create more nuance for our understanding of these strategies. The next one is distract. So again, that's interrupting to divert attention. And a lot of the times it can interrupt the bias without confrontation. Again, this is maybe some of the options that people who would normally directly address would try to utilize if they're not comfortable with confrontation. And it may alleviate tension for the person being harmed, in that if you are very nuanced and aware of what you're saying to try and distract, the attention is taken off of them. Maybe they aren't immediately clocked as the person that is harmed. And it can give them the potential to get away or kind of detach from the situation. As a drawback, though, it does have the perception of downplaying harm. Depending on what you say, depending on the kind of joke, for example, that you might use, it could be perceived as you're trying to not make the bias known. You're not actually addressing the situation. So it is something to consider if you're trying to use the distract method. And because of downplaying the harm, because that potential drawback, you may also embolden the person doing harm. They may perceive it as a kind of green light, if you will, to kind of continue with that behavior. So being really intentional with how you distract is really important when you're considering this particular strategy. Then we have delegate, which is, again, that enlisting someone else to help you. That eases some of the responsibility, particularly for people who are not as confident, who are not as knowledgeable about what they can do. It helps ease some of that responsibility to make it potential, a combination of approaches. Someone might directly address, you might follow up. But it also promotes collaboration. And I think the really key part here is when you delegate or you kind of enlist someone to help you, you are encouraging the conversation about addressing bias. You are directly circumventing that culture of silence that can appear in an organization, just like Tom talked about previously. The drawback is that sometimes there can be discrepancy. If you're not on the same page about the kind of response you want to have, someone may unintentionally escalate while you're trying to diffuse the situation. So that is something to be aware of. And then, of course, the complexity of existing relationships. So if someone maybe is a friend to the person doing harm, it may be harder for them to address the situation in a meaningful way that actually gets the person to change their behavior. So depending on how you delegate, how you enlist someone, that might alter the way that you have that conversation. And then lastly, this is kind of the time process that we've talked about with delay, addressing it after the fact in any unique combination that you might have. There's the benefit of addressing it long-term, particularly if you use this in combination with kind of in-the-moment techniques. You continue that conversation about bias, about what does that have the effect on in our climate, in our space, in our organization. And then you are also potentially responding in less tension. If you take time after the fact to address it, people maybe are more aware of what they're saying. They're perhaps less confrontational with you. So those are the potential benefits. And then also drawback, kind of similar to the distracting, you kind of get the perception sometimes of ignoring the issue. If you take an exceptionally long time, it can be kind of difficult to maybe fully address what actually happened, be able to make changes, have accountability set in there. And then, of course, if you take too long, the situation might repeat, it might escalate. This is, again, a potential chance that someone may be emboldened by the lack of response. So it is important to consider that if delay is your option that you're going to go for, considering exactly how much time that you're actually waiting before you respond. And then lastly, we have document, which is that gathering of evidence for potential reporting. This is, again, accountability measures. These are some of the things that I think particularly difficult for organizations. You know, it's very easy to tell your friend, like, hey, that text you sent, and you show them and say, I don't really like that. It might be more difficult in an organizational setting to have those accountability structures in a meaningful way. And it also is a form of kind of deterrent and transparency. If we are aware of the content that we're sending out to people, if we are encouraging people to be mindful of that, people will in the future consider what they're saying, what they're doing in those spaces. However, drawback, some of the informal interactions that we have, it can be kind of difficult to document. You're not going to whip out your phone if someone's saying something pretty terrible in a meeting. So it can be kind of difficult in those spaces. And then it also makes it potentially part of a searchable record. And this is something that we're going to talk about in a little bit. When we are considering the person that's being harmed in this situation, it's really important to emphasize what they need and what they want. And maybe that person doesn't want to be having their notes as an employee that, oh, this bias incident happened. Maybe they're concerned for a negative connotation. So it's one of the drawbacks with documentation that should be considered as you're thinking through what you might do. So just as a wrap up, key things to keep in mind, there is no better or worse intervention. What we're trying to emphasize here is that it's important for you to intervene and that each one of them has their own kind of situational, personal benefit. And that intervening at the best possible point looks different for different people. There is a lot of conversation about intervening as soon as you can. For some people, it is not as feasible. It's not as safe to do that. So it is okay to consider your safety, your ability, and what that means for you. But we do encourage you to, at the best point possible, address it, because it is important to address bias that happens around us. Again, keeping the needs and the wants of the person or people being harmed is really important. And then lastly, consider the historical context of what you're deciding to do. A lot of the original bystander intervention conversation, particularly around like Delegate, mentioned the police a lot, mentioned reporting structures a lot. And that can be more harmful than helpful, depending on the identities of the person who's being harmed. So just consider, you know, what does this institution have the effect on for specific communities, and how might it specifically affect the person being involved? So that's an important piece. And again, intervention is like learning to use a muscle. It's becoming stronger in that muscle. It's intentional and, you know, practice oriented for us to be able to become better in our intervention strategies. So with all of that, I'm going to throw it over to Matt, and we're going to move into some scenarios for us to practice.
Thank you, Olivia. So in just a minute, what's going to happen is you're going to get an opportunity to sort of process or try out some of the things that we've been discussing and sort of think out loud with some of your colleagues. What we're going to do is we're going to, in just a moment, share a scenario, and I'll go through it briefly. And then you will go into breakout rooms and process these. And what I want you to think about, and if you don't remember all the things I'm going to talk about here, don't worry, I will put them in the chat after you've been sent to the breakout rooms. But some direction for processing these scenarios, I want you to think about 4 questions. First and foremost, who is being harmed? Identify the person being harmed. The second question is, how might the 5 Ds that we've discussed, how might they play out? You know, this is where you might want to do the risk benefit analysis sort of thing. The third question is, how would each of the 5 Ds affect the person being harmed? And finally, describe what it would look like if you selected a particular intervention. So, you know, within those 5 or 4 questions, there's a little bit of, you know, play and that sort of thing. And again, if you don't remember those, I will send those once the groups have been broken out. And I'll also put the 5 Ds in there as well. So let's have a look at the first scenario that you're going to be working with. All right, here we go. Let me move something here real quick. A male colleague or peer is lamenting that he is never rewarded for his accomplishment as much as or as easily as women. He claims that he must work harder because the system rewards undeserving women. He claims men also need to work harder to demonstrate their commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion issues. So again, we're going to send you to a room. We're going to process this. I will send the 4 questions that I was talking about. Feel free to use those if those will help facilitate the discussion. Are we ready, Olivia? Let's do it.
Yep, people have been invited to join their rooms. And while this is happening, you can go ahead and pause the recording.
Okay, good call. Okay, we're recording again. So hopefully that was fruitful discussion. Quick technical question. Did I correctly broadcast all the questions and the 5 Ds and all that? Can you give me a thumbs up if that worked?
It did broadcast. However, could you do me a favor and put it in the chat? That way people have record of it when they break out.
Yes, I will do that. Let's move on to the next scenario, and then I'll put those in there. Let me get organized here. So here we have, and we're going to do the same thing. We're going to go to the breakout rooms here in a minute. A male colleague or peer is explaining a project to a group of people and has made several statements claiming ownership of the project in front of your the female colleague or peer who actually spearheaded the project. So again, the questions you're wanting to think about are: who's being harmed? How might the 5 Ds play out? And how would each affect the person being harmed? Describe what it might look like if you did one of these interventions or something along these lines. And then again, if you need a refresher on what the 5 Ds are, they are here. And let's do it. Let's go back into breakout rooms and see what comes up.
Back up. Wonderful. I was just telling people as they were slowly trickling in, we're going to chat a little bit about institutional position to get a better idea of some of that like supervisory kind of power relations that can affect some people's responses to these particular scenarios, situations, and how that will influence the choices you make.
Absolutely. Let's do it. I think we have everybody.
Perfect.
So as Olivia mentioned, like it's sort of come up in the discussion already, we got to talk about institutional position and how do we understand institutional position. It's been found in the studies that the people who perpetrate acts of bias often target somebody of the same or lower rank. The likelihood of intervention is much higher when a peer or subordinate witnesses bias. There's more comfort and a greater sense of empowerment to address these situations in that case. When someone in a higher position perpetrates bias, there's a perception that there's a much higher cost of intervening. So what I'm talking about here is like in the university world, it's the obvious example would be between like a professor and a graduate assistant or something like that, right? But there's all kinds of examples you can do, a coach and a athlete or something like that. Further, so folks in a lower position often feel like that, or in a lower rank or lower on the pay scale, or however you choose to think about it, they often feel like it's the superior's duty to address these incidents of bias. Sort of, it's not my job. They don't feel empowered to do it. So not only do they feel like there's a higher cost, but they don't feel empowered to do it. So how do we, when we're dealing with these sorts of issues, how do we mitigate the effects of these sort of power dynamics? Well, the conversations about bias and bystander intervention has to happen at all levels from top to bottom of a given organization, and it has to happen frequently. It can't be just a one-time thing. And in doing so, you create a culture where in that organization where bias isn't really tolerated or isn't tolerated. People in positions of authority have to have buy-in early. So managers, departmental heads, supervisors, you have to become early adopters of these sorts of these conversations. You have to keep it on everyone's radar. So that's just as important, and just as important as having the conversation often and frequently. When there is an incident of bias, the procedures for reporting this and the follow-up procedures have to be not only effective, but they have to be known across the given organization. So these are some of the ways that you can mitigate some of the effects of power dynamics. So rigorous and well-publicized reporting and follow-up procedures. So that's the extra wrinkle that we're going to be talking about here in a second. I've kind of breezed through that. So let's go ahead and jump into the next set of scenarios. Here we go. We're gonna, we have a male supervisor is explaining a project to a group of people and has made several statements claiming ownership of the project in front of the woman supervisee who actually spearheaded the project. So again, the difference here, this is very similar to what we've already talked about, right? But now we've introduced this, this power dynamic. So let's talk about how we would handle that.
And just so people are aware, we're opening the rooms. This is the same scenario as the last time we had a breakout room. But this time we've switched up the position of the person who's doing the harm. So we're going to send you back into the same groups so that you can kind of have similar conversations, but build it more in this idea of, okay, here's this layer of power now. What do we do? What might I do? And I will have Matt, I'll switch to our last scenario and then we'll throw back into random groups this time.
Sorry about that. Here we go. So that was interesting. That produced some pretty awesome conversations. So let's continue it. Your supervisor responds to your colleague's pregnancy announcement with, "Why didn't you tell me you planned on getting pregnant?" So how do we, who's being harmed? How might the 5 Bs play out? How would it affect the person being harmed? And describe what it would look like, what your intervention might look like. I want to quickly to own up to a mistake, or not a mistake. I did not cite my sources on the introducing institutional position slide. So we will revise the slides before we make them available to you and put the source on there. I apologize for that.
We do recognize that people might need to head out, so we would love if you can, it's in the chat as well as this QR code right here. Please fill out an evaluation for this particular session. We'd love to hear your feedback, including stuff like, you know, hey, I'd love to see more sources on our slides. That's great. But please feel free to fill it out. And we hope that this session was able to provide you a lot of reflection and learning and processing that will help you in the future when you're trying to respond to bias. And if you have any questions or anything, put them in the chat or hang out. We'll be here listening, ready to talk, but of course. And thank you. Yes, I was just about to say the same thing. RC, thank you so much for sharing that information.